Okay, so it looks like we've got some steady numbers in there, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. Good morning, everyone. My name is Dr. Brandon Stark. I'm the director of the UC Center of Excellence on Unmanned Aircraft System Safety. I help the students, staff, and faculty of the UC system with drone everything, seems like these days. I mostly deal with UAS regulations, safety, and training. I also do teach a course here at UC Merced. I kind of do that on my free time. A little bit more of it these days with the pandemic and all. But nonetheless, there's always still work to be doing. So I'm happy to share with everyone today a little bit more, some of our more advanced flying trainings. If you're within the UC system and you want to learn more about drones and some of the other resources and opportunities that we help with here at the center, go ahead and send me an email. My email address, uassafety@ucmerced.edu. We have all sorts of other resources and training opportunities, training sessions. I do travel around to many of the campuses when it is safe to do so. And that allows me to give some hands-on workshops as time permits. So today, or this morning, I'm going to be talking about some more interesting challenges, some of the more advanced challenges of dealing with drone operations in controlled airspace. Now, hopefully, many of you aren't going to be operating in controlled airspace, but nonetheless, you may find yourself with many of your study sites next to or nearby airports or more urban areas. And so we really need to think carefully and critically about how we approach airspace management and safety in these areas. So we're going to cover today airspace authorizations, what you need to know and what you need to do to get access to fly in some of these controlled airspaces, as well as we're going to cover in more detail more things about airspace safety. Now, we covered some of that yesterday in the VO training. I'm going to go into a little bit more detail on some effective tips and tricks for managing your airspace safety. So hopefully, as you might remember, if you're going to be operating in controlled airspace, you will need to get some sort of approval. Now, under Part 107, you will need to get that airspace approval, and there's many different options that you need to do. Under the newer recreational model aircraft regulations, they all have also tacked on the requirement for you to gain airport approval to fly in these controlled airspaces. Now, controlled airspaces are generally associated with airports, but not all airports do have controlled airspace. So you'll always want to check on an appropriate airspace map to determine what type of airspace you are planning to be flying in. Now, I have a handful of graphics that you can use to think about. So I've got my little graphic right here, labeling the major types of airports. I like to think of our Class B airports. These are our big airports, our LAX, our San Francisco airports. Then our Class C airspaces. These are associated with decently large airports, but not super huge airports. So we're talking Sacramento, we're talking Fresno, we're talking what's some other good Class C, Santa Barbara, another good Class C airport. Class D, these would maybe be our dinky little airports. Nonetheless, they have some controlled airspace. These would be airports if you're from the Central Valley. I've got Stockton Airport near me, Castle Airport. There's some other smaller airports. These generally don't have a lot of commercial general aviation flights, commercial flights. They do have some general aviation flights, but you're not going to be flying out of, say, Stockton Airport too often. Class E airports and Class Class G airports, those are going to be the smaller ones, primarily geared for only general aviation, so private pilots. Surface Class E and Class G airports are generally more interesting. They're going to have a lot smaller aircraft flying around, but definitely not as often or as critical. Now, if you need to fly next to any of these larger airports, you will need to get airspace authorization. And there's two main methods to do so. There's the LAANC method, and then the DRONEZONE airspace authorization process. And we're going to talk about both of those in more detail. But first, where do we find this information? The most official source of information is going to be the FAA facility maps. You can find airspace information on many other charts, SkyVector, VFR charts, AirMap, Skyward, lots of different sources, even the Before You Fly app that you can download. But I do find that the FAA UAS facility maps to be probably, it should be on your top list of places to go to as you do your pre-flight planning. And this is because it does tell you about how you might be able to get airspace authorization in those areas. So if you look at the FAA airspace facility map, you'll notice if you go around to an airport, we're going to find a number of different symbols and symbologies on our maps. A little bit different than you would see on a VFR chart. So on our FAA facility map, you notice that we've got our airspaces, my area in Merced and Castle, Atwater. I've got boxes now. Instead of just the airspace circles, I have some of these grid boxes. Some grids are drawn in green and some grids are drawn in red. If they are drawn in green, these green squares means that we can use the LAANC airspace authorization process. If we want to be operating in one of these red squares, they're not LAANC enabled, and so we will have to use the DroneZone airspace authorization process. The number written in red inside each of these grids represents how high we're allowed to fly in that particular area. Or not necessarily how high, but rather what the FAA hopes that you will limit your flight activities to. This is going to be the ceiling for each of those grids. Talk a little bit more about that differentiation in just a slide. So if I'm looking in the city of Merced, downtown Merced, lots of zero grids, more or less meaning I'm not allowed to fly above 0 feet above ground level. But if I go out to farther out, say over by some of the housing areas, that's as high as 400 feet. So within those grids, I would be allowed to fly up to 400 feet AGL. But if I look into my red grids, I still see the same numbers, 0, 200, 400. These numbers are still indicating what that ceiling of airspace authorization approval will be. But again, we have to use the different process in order to get that access. Now the ceiling altitude for each of these grids are developed by the airport tower themselves. The airport tower, Castle Airport, and Merced Airport, these are the entities that made this chart. And then they supply that to the FAA, where the FAA is the one who then enforces these altitude restrictions. So the easiest method to get airspace authorization is through LAANC. LAANC is the Low Altitude Airspace Notification Capability System. Most people just refer to it as LAANC because Low Altitude Airspace Notification Capability is a long phrase to say. So within LAANC, there are two processes for getting airspace approval. The easiest process is the automatic approval process. If your flight altitude is below the ceiling listed within the grid, then as soon as you apply for access, it will be automatically granted to you. You still have to apply. Even though it's an automatic process, you do still have to apply. So make sure that even if you're within a 200 grid and you only plan on flying 100 feet, you are still legally obligated to get that airspace authorization, even if you know it will be an automatic approval. Now, the challenge with the LAANC system is, what if you want to go above that grid? So if a grid is listed at a 200-foot ceiling, but you want to fly at 250 feet or 300 feet, well, then we need to get a manual approval through the LAANC process. So this is a slightly different process. The interface for that will be the same, but it'll have to go through some additional steps. So what happens here, if your flight altitude is above a ceiling, you would submit a request. Then the airport tower will receive that request. And then the airport tower will review, and then they must manually approve it. So this does have to go to the airport tower for approval. The automatic approval process is handled through the FAA through third-party LAANC apps, but the manual approval process is handled at the airport tower level. Now, one other caveat to our LAANC manual approval process is that the manual approval process is only for Part 107 holders only. Recreational or academic exceptions are not eligible for manual approval process. You're not going to be eligible for flying above the listed ceiling altitude. So if you're an academic and you do not have a Part 107 license and you want to fly 300 feet in a 200-foot grid, unfortunately, you're going to be out of luck. In that case, you would have to go earn your Part 107 license or find somewhere else to fly. So this is in general how that LAANC process works. Now, how do we file a LAANC request? LAANC requests are not handled by the FAA directly. They are handled by third-party applications, typically that you find on your phone. So I've listed a couple on the screen up here. These are some of the bigger, more effective ones that I found in my case. AirMap. You can download the AirMap app through iOS, Android, but you can also use it online. They do have a web portal for you to request airspace access. Skyward has a complete UAS management system, and they also do allow you to file airspace authorizations, but if you are an enterprise customer. Kitty Hawk also has an iOS and Android app that you can use to apply for airspace authorizations. Another one that is a little bit less heard of is UAS Sidekick. They do charge $5 a month, but I have found that to be actually a pretty good one. The Kitty Hawk interface I found to be a little bit complicated if all I wanted to do was just fly in a simple location. I found UAS Sidekick to be a little bit easier to use. Now, these are just the 4 major ones that I'm familiar with. Now, there are many others who have been approved to be a LAANC provider. However, they do not have public interfaces yet. Hopefully, we will see some more public companies providing public interface with the LAANC system. The FAA is currently doing a round of onboarding to see if they can get more users, more suppliers for the LAANC network. That one, they initially announced that back in February with the coronavirus. I'm not sure if that timeline has been impacted. The original timeline was anticipated that new companies would be onboarded by October. Yes, so a 107 license is needed for manual approvals. Recreational and academic can still use the automatic approvals, but you need a Part 107 for the manual approval. Now, a little bit more detail on that manual approval process. So the automatic approval process, you would put in your information, my name, my pilot number, if I have one, the drone that will be flying, where I'm going to be flying, the time, and at what altitude I'm going to be flying at. And you put that information in, you click submit, and it goes in. 10 seconds later, you get a response back. The manual approval process is a little bit more tricky in that you have to submit this one significantly in advance. So the manual LAANC authorization request must be submitted in at least 24 hours prior to your requested flight time. So if I wanted to fly on Saturday at 10 a.m., I need to make sure that my request is in before Friday at 9:55. But you can't submit more than 90 days in advance. So somewhere between 90 days ahead and 24 hours ahead is when you need to submit. When the submit request goes in, you submit in the request, it gets forwarded to the airport tower, and the airport tower can either approve or deny that request. But there's a little bit of a caveat to that one too, in that the FAA will automatically cancel any request that is not resolved 24 hours prior to the requested flight time. So if I submit in my request to fly Saturday at 10 a.m., and I submit that one in at Friday at 9:55 a.m., the airport tower has 5 minutes to review and approve it before it gets automatically canceled by the FAA. So in practice, you're going to want to make sure that the airport tower has plenty of time to actually review that flight request before it gets automatically canceled by the FAA. Now, here's part of the downside to this as well. Airport towers are not obligated to approve any manual authorizations. They are not obligated to approve. They are actually not even obligated to look at them. They are told that they should, but they are told to that they have the complete authority over their airspace. And they are the ones who get to make all of the decisions about that. Which means that you may find some airports that are less responsive than others, which can be a bit of a challenge. So best practice, always submit in your LAANC manual approval requests as early as you can. And if you are anticipating some sort of weather challenges, make sure that you submit in multiple. You never know. Right? Weather can be hard to predict. Now, LAANC has been okay. It's been okay. It hasn't been perfect. It's been 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And I'll tell you that John Wayne around UC Irvine has been, one of my problem sites. One of my problem sites. They have told me many times that they will not authorize any zero zone requests. Of course, I've actually heard some changes to that one too, but they're not returning my calls either. So that's on my to-do list to resolve as well. Now, the FAA has issued internal policy guidance that airport towers are not to grant any verbal authorizations. You can try to call the tower and ask, but they are not obligated to respond to any verbal calls. The FAA is directing all airport towers, all requests must go through the internet. Even further than that, the FAA has given instructions to all of the LAANC providers to discourage their users from calling air traffic control in regards to following up with air traffic control by phone to see why the request was rejected. And they've even given those towers somewhat of a leeway to reject a request if that proponent calls the tower. The towers also do not have to give any justification as to why they've denied a flight request. And unfortunately, there is no mechanism, no formal mechanism to argue or request any sort of hearing to change any of these facility map ceilings. So the airport towers in these cases have all the authority to dictate what constitutes safe and legal drone activity within their control. So as long as you've got a friendly airport to work with, LAANC has been okay. You may find yourself, unfortunately, with some less than friendly airports. So that's LAANC. LAANC works. It works well when it works, and it doesn't work well when it doesn't work. So hopefully you find yourself with a friendly area and a LAANC-friendly zone. But what about some of our airports that are not LAANC enabled? To get airspace access in some of those non-LAANC enabled areas, here we need to go back to the drone zone. Now remember, the drone zone is where you originally registered your drone. So you would go back to that drone zone to where you put in your drone registration with the FAA. Again, this is why it's very important that you use only the correct legal FAA registration site, the drone zone, because you are able here to tie your drone registration to airspace authorizations through DroneZone. Now, DroneZone airspace authorizations are only for non-LAANC enabled airspace. They will only be accepted in areas that have the red square, the red grid. The FAA will automatically deny any airspace authorization in a LAANC enabled zone. Now there's a little bit of a caveat to that, and I'll actually talk about that one in our night flying session in the next hour. Drone zone authorizations, unfortunately, can take anywhere between 2 days and 8 months. I've seen them go through super quick over a weekend, and I've had some in airspaces that take 8 months. I think my record is 13 months for an airspace authorization. Now, how long it takes is dependent on the altitude, location, and whether that airport tower actually checks their email. Because I found in my experience that the people processing these airspace authorizations are contract employees by the FAA. They'll send out an email to the airport tower, and then they may forget to follow up with that airport tower for several months, in which case you might have to track them down to see what the status of your airspace authorization is at. Now, airspace authorizations, there's for many of us in organizations, there is some capability here that you may be granted an organization-wide airspace authorization, an organization-wide operational waiver, but you do need to have some sort of oversight or management system in place. So typically these airspace authorizations are written to a pilot, but you can list them out to an organization as long as you have a responsible person who is an administrator or some sort of organizer for your organization that can keep and track the use of this airspace authorization. Now, our drone zone airspace authorizations come in 2 different flavors. We have our specific site authorizations. These are ones if we are flying in a non-LAANC enabled zone and we want to fly above the listed facility altitude, we need to specify specifically our site and the altitude, typically done as a point and radius, a nice cylinder. Typically we might look at these in more military controlled airspaces. There's also the wide area authorization. These are the wider that covers the entire controlled airspace, in which case you would be given the automatic approval for all flight requests under the listed altitude within a particular grid within that UAS facility map. So that one covers the entire controlled airspace as long as we agree to follow whatever that facility map altitude is. This is something more commonly that you might find necessary for some of these privately managed towers. Now, filing a drone zone airspace authorization, there's a nice, relatively simple form. It does pull information from your registration and helps autofill stuff, and then you'll still have to put in, here is where I want to fly. You provide the latitude and longitude, what airport you'll be flying nearby, how high you want to be flying. But then they'll ask two very benign questions that if you get wrong, they'll just deny you right out. So you want to take special care to make sure that we answer these two questions very carefully. So the first question that they're going to ask is just very benignly, what is the proposed location of operation? What they don't tell you is what they actually mean is that the FAA is going to read that carefully and they're going to try to use Google Maps to figure out what area that you're talking about. So if you're saying, oh, I want to be flying around the arts building at the UC Santa Barbara campus, well, they have no idea what that actually means. And so when you're trying to fill out this proposed location, use street names and addresses. Imagine that they're going to be looking up this location on Google Maps, and the Google Map information is all that they're going to have available to them. These FAA reviewers, at least at the first level, are going to be thousands of miles away. Most of the people that I deal with for our authorizations and the UC system, they're based up in Washington. And so they've never been to California. They don't know how busy the I-5 freeway is. And so that could be a little bit of challenge. So make sure that you do describe your area of operations in good amount of detail to help them understand where you're actually going to be flying. The second odd question that you're going to have to ask is, very naively, the FAA is just going to ask you to put in an answer of, put in your description of your proposed operation. Now, if you're just looking at this for the first time, you might just put in, well, I'm going to fly to cover this particular event. Unfortunately, that's not the answer that they're looking for. What the FAA is actually looking for is they want to understand what you'll be up to in a little bit more detail and whether or not you have a sufficient safety case for doing so. So in your answer for your proposed operations, make sure that you describe some of the other things that you'll be taking into account as you do your operations, especially that safety case, air traffic considerations, ground hazard considerations, any sort of documentation or safety review processes. The FAA again here is looking, they want to have an understanding as to whether or not this is going to be a safe operation, taking into account both the airspace considerations as well as the ground traffic and other ground hazard challenges. So breaking down our airspace authorizations, We have a nice little flow chart for us. We got our airspace authorizations. If we're looking on the FAA facility map, if we're in green squares, we're going to be utilizing the LAANC process. If we're in red squares, we need to use DRONEZONE. If we're below the ceiling and we're using LAANC, we'll always get automatically approved. But if we're above the ceiling in a green square, we'll have the three different options. It'll either be approved, denied by air traffic control, or denied by the FAA. And if we're in a red square, we're using the DRONEZONE process. If we're always going to be flying below the ceilings, we'll have our option to get this wide area authorization. And we need to make sure that we have a generic safety case for dealing with flight operations within that facility map. But if we're looking for flying above that ceiling, now we need to be very specific and build a very specific safety case for flight operations above that facility map altitude. One more thing to also keep in mind for these specific site authorizations, again, the FAA and the airport towers are not obligated to give you approval. You can, and in many cases, will be denied flight operations in some of these areas. So again, can we call the tower and ask for authorizations? For many years, this was what many drone pilots did. If you were a recreational operator, you would call the tower. If you were, at the beginning, 4 or 5 years ago, this was more or less kind of the standard operating procedure. You would call up the tower, ask them for approval because you didn't want to go through the paperwork process. Well, the FAA has really cracked down on this one. Again, they have their own internal policy guidance. Basically says if an air traffic control facility receives a call, to then just immediately redirect them to the FAA DroneZone website. In regards to the question about will lat-long work for authorization location, lat-long is going to be a minimum to that, but you should do a much more complete job and also describe your proposed location in details. Is this an agricultural field? Is this an urban environment? What types of situations might you encounter in that area? So within the form, they'll have a spot for that latitude and longitude, but you'll need to expand upon that description in a little bit more detail. Now, there's also some airports that actually close down their controlled airspace. And in this case, that airspace will revert to Class G when the towers are closed. So some airports, though, the airspace will revert to Class G at night, but some will actually also close down to Class G on the weekends as well. Now, you're not going to find this information in any of the VFR or airspace maps. For this, you'll need to look through the digital chart supplement. Now, for many of you who studied and passed their 107, I'm sure you were always told to go look at the chart supplement, but probably you never actually did. The airport chart supplement is where you find more details about every single airport in the US. And you can find some real interesting nuggets of information there. So if you find yourself working in a complicated airspace, I would recommend looking through that airport information and the chart supplement and to help you understand a little bit more about that airport. Now I'm going to throw up an example of where this tower closure might be useful. All right, this is down in San Diego. I get a lot of questions about flying in Imperial Beach. We got our UC San Diego teams. I think we have like 4 or 5 UC San Diego teams wanting to be operating in the Imperial Beach area. And they look at this map and they get a little worried because there's a lot of zero grids in this area, which means, and it's a military airspace or military tower there. It's not LAANC enabled. It's all red, all zeros. So it's a little bit of a challenging area to work with. But is it impossible to fly here? Not quite. Dangerous, challenging, but not impossible. We can actually look through the Imperial Beach section of our digital chart supplement. We can find a little bit more information in here. So as we dig through this giant block of very dense text, we find our magic words, other times class G. Meaning our airspace for this airport is class D only for these listed times, and then in all other times this reverts down to class G, where you do not need an airspace authorization. Now this airport, Imperial Beach, is class D only during these given times, from 1600 to 0630 Zulu time, Monday through Friday, 1600 to 0200 Zulu time on Fridays, and then it's closed from 0200 Zulu time from the day prior till 1600 Zulu time the day following a governmental holiday. Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar with Zulu time, I put the conversion over to the right. So 1600 Zulu time is 8 o'clock Pacific Standard Time in the winter, and 10:30 p.m. Standard Time is 0630 Zulu time. During daylight savings times, or the summer out here, our operations, it's class D from 1500 to 0600. So that again, it's 8 a.m. Pacific Daylight Time during the summer, and 11 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time also during the summer, but on ending at 11 p.m. at night. So more or less, Mondays through Thursdays, local time, this airport is class D from 8 a.m. to 10:30 or 11 p.m. depending if it's summer or winter. Except on Fridays, where they close it down early at 6 p.m. Which means that this airspace is class G on the weekends and federal holidays. On the weekends and federal holidays, you do not need an airspace authorization. Now, whether or not it is safe to fly is a completely different question, right? On the weekends, this beach might be, say, it's slightly busy with people going to the beach. Federal holidays might be the same. We have 4th of July coming up. I'm sure that there will be many of beachgoers out there during that time. But it does offer a slight reprieve for those unable to get airspace access from an airspace authorization. So one other little trick and caveat to getting airspace authorizations where it may be difficult to do so. Now we do also have to look at, again, our temporary flight restrictions, our TFRs. Now many of us who've taken the 107 exam, we know roughly about our temporary flight restrictions, enough to know that some of these temporary flight restrictions aren't really temporary. Our TFRs come in several different flavors. I've listed out the 4 major ones that you might encounter: disaster areas, demonstrations and major sporting events, typically aerial demonstrations rather. Whenever the president and vice president are in town, that entire area closes down. Luckily, most of us are based out here in the West Coast, where we don't get a whole lot of that. And then we have our special security instructions. These TFRs include our Disneyland and Disney World flight restrictions, the flight restrictions for our Major League Baseball, National Football League, and NCAA Division I football games, as well as Department of Defense and military installations. Yes, also a good point, and we'll talk more about night flying on in about 20 or so minutes. Even if the airspace reverts to Class G, you might still need a nighttime flying waiver to fly at night. So even if the airspace reverts to Class G, it's not open access, you still have to follow and abide by all other 107 regulations. Now, sometimes you might need to fly in some of these flight restrictions. You need to get authorization from the controlling entity. Some of the SSI restrictions will have published points of contact that you can go through. Others, they'll actually direct you to a website, the FAA TSA Airspace Access Program. But keep in mind that every process is different. Every group is going to be different. Be prepared to talk with a handful of different people with different levels of knowledge. So flying in a TFR, unfortunately, is not always going to be straightforward. And many times it will be a lot of work to fly through. It does help if you've got someone within the organization to champion, but as an outsider, it may be prohibitive to fly within a TFR. Now, what about emergency situations? So emergency airspace authorizations or waivers, they do exist. If it's an emergency and you can't abide by Part 107 regulations, you can file through the FAA's Special Governmental Interest process. They've got a website set up for that. You fill out a form, you email the system. The turnaround time, in my experience, has been roughly between 2 to 5 hours. So it's been a pretty good process. This is a process that you'll hear being utilized for drone support in many of the emergency operations, and including some of disaster response support as well. Now, when might you need a special emergency waiver? Say if you want to ask for flying in a controlled airspace where you do not yet have an airspace authorization. Flying at night in a controlled airspace without a night waiver at that location, but you'll still actually need to have a night waiver to be eligible for that. And you may also be able to ask for flying over people or beyond visual line of sight if there's an immediate and demonstrable need. So you'll hear of many of these larger companies or groups obtaining special permissions to fly in some of these disaster zones. This is a process that they go through. So lots of information there. Again, these slides will be available for you to look through and go through at your own time. So in my last 7 minutes or so, we'll go over some more details on operating in our high air traffic zones. Now, even though we've been talking about controlled airspace, we also have to remember that even in Class G, there are still going to be pockets of heavy air traffic that's going to make drone flying very difficult. Remember, as a drone pilot, you are responsible for yielding right-of-way to all other traffic. Unfortunately, it's a lot easier said than done. This is a particularly challenging video. Hopefully you can see it. It's a little slow here, but this is a video that I found of someone operating in Miami. And he's flying along the beach there. He's just looking around, panning around. And it's not till that very last second that we see that helicopter fly right there. And that drone pilot, now you can imagine if you're looking at your tiny little drone cell phone screen, would you have seen that helicopter come at you? That would have been just a couple of pixels on your phone screen, and you would have had mere seconds to respond to that. Flying a drone can be dangerous. And we saw that fun video earlier this morning of a drone being thrown into a plane wing. That's a pretty fun one. All sorts of other fun videos of drones crashing into windshields. Lots of real fun research on this topic, but they all point to one thing. Yes, a drone can seriously damage an aircraft and a helicopter, and it can be very life-threatening. Flying a drone is like a kid playing in a road. You should think about this as, in these terms, you should really only be in the sky just long enough to complete your mission. You must be always vigilant and always on the lookout, and remember, you're going to be incredibly vulnerable to high-speed collisions. You're a drone, you're hovering, you're barely moving, then you've got some plane whipping across at 180 miles an hour. It's just a recipe for disaster. It is a challenging situation. And unfortunately, all of that responsibility of getting out of the way is placed on you, the drone pilot. And that's a lot. That really is a lot of responsibility. It is your responsibility to remember that a plane could be whipping across the horizon at 180 miles an hour, and you need to get your tiny little drone out of its way in a sufficient amount of time. Now, with any amount of sense and avoid, we need to think about this in terms of both our collision avoidance maneuvers as well as our self-separation. Our collision avoidance and our self-separation, we need to think about these in the proper terms because both of these are critical to understanding how we get ourselves out of these particular situations. Now, I am definitely running out of time here, so I'll try to speed through my last couple of slides. But here's see and avoid in 4 easy steps. First, we need to observe. We need to then identify, assess, and then act. We need to accomplish all 4 of these steps in order to be effective at see and avoid. Now, many of us might think of seeing and avoiding as just seeing a plane and assessing whether or not, but we also need to remember that acting and getting out of its way is a crucial element and also takes time. It doesn't do us any good to see that we're about to be hit if we can't react and get out of its way in time. So we need to make sure that we budget our time and minimize how much time it takes to go through all of these steps such that we have a sufficient amount of time to act and get out of a plane's way. Now, the first step to our see and avoid is we need to first observe. We need to be always observing and looking, detecting, and trying to identify or track down other air traffic. So how do we minimize the amount of time it takes to observe a threat? Bringing visual observers is one of the key things. Focusing on the horizon where our threats are, and trying to maintain a sterile cockpit or avoiding extraneous conversations to make sure that all of us are on task during our flight operations. So we talked about this a little bit on how to monitor for air traffic in our visual observer talk. Remember that helicopters are actually one of our biggest threats. We have to remember that our helicopters are typically the ones that fly low and relatively quickly. Now, how do we monitor for air traffic? Again, start at the horizon, scan left to right, moving up as we go. Again, all of these slides will be available for you to look through at your own leisure later on. So, empty field myopia, that's one of those visual illusions that we end up having to deal with a lot. And I have to remind ourselves, I'm looking out my window here and I see nothing but blue sky. That's a prime situation where empty field myopia will detract from my ability to see and detect intruding aircraft. So even though a bright blue empty sky sounds like great flying weather, it actually makes our jobs as visual observers a little bit harder. So once we see an aircraft, what do we do next? Well, now we need to make sure that we can identify whether or not this is a threat. So what tips and tricks can we use to speed up our threat assessment, or identifying a threat? Utilize visual observers from different vantage points can help us identify whether or not this aircraft is going to be on a collision course. We must be able to remember and learn how to recognize the conditions of an actual threat. If we hear an aircraft and we see it, we are able to find it directly above us, at that point it's either about to hit us or it's not actually going to be a threat. If we see an aircraft that's flying parallel and moving very quickly across the horizon, that's not going to be a threat. But if we see an aircraft on the horizon that doesn't look like it's moving, that's going to be a problem. That's something that we're going to have to keep an eye on. Remember our blossom effect. An aircraft that's on a collision course with us doesn't look like it's going to be moving very quickly at all until it's way, way too late. How do we minimize the time to assess a threat? Well, let's try to keep our drone close to us. The further away our drone is away from us, the harder it is to tell whether or not any intruding aircraft is going to be on a collision course with us. The further away that our drone is from us, the harder it makes it for us to determine how much a threat any other obstacles are going to be. But if we are going to end up having to fly from a significant distance away from us, make sure that we pre-identify escape routes or actions to take. Remember about judging heading, right? If we see an aircraft racing across the horizon, that's not going to be a major threat. But if we see an aircraft on the horizon, it doesn't look like it's moving, that could mean that it's actually on a collision course with us. We have to pay special care and attention to. Remember, our human eyes, we're just absolutely terrible at judging distance and altitude. That's okay, but treat everything as a potential threat until you're certain that it's not. Our final step for see and avoid, our most critical one, how do we make sure that our reaction time to act and get out of an aircraft's way is as short as possible? So how do we minimize the time it takes to act on a threat? Well, keep our fingers always in position to react. Remember where our emergency buttons are. How to immediately get ourselves out of an automatic mode and into manual mode. How to immediately bring our aircraft down in case we need to. Keep in mind that we might find ourselves in a situation where we have to assess, do we go straight up or do we go straight down to get out of an aircraft's way? So make sure that your fingers are always in position. It's very tempting for us who do a lot of automatic mapping missions to let our controller dangle from our neck as we got it on our lanyard. But that's not good safety habits. Always make sure that your thumbs are always on the control sticks at all times, even during our automatic flying. You never know when you need to pull it out of an automatic mode and into a manual flight. Okay, so I went a little over time here. That's okay. I'll just take some of that time off from my next presentation, which is going to be on night flying. I'll cut that one short just a little bit. But some final notes for you, some takeaways here. Remember, always pay attention to the airspace that you're going to be operating in. It doesn't matter if you're operating Class B or Class G. All of it can potentially be dangerous. Remember, you're always likely to hear an aircraft long before you see it, so always keep paying attention. Always be scanning the horizon, because that's where our most immediate incoming aerial threats are going to be. remember that if we do have any incoming aircraft, if a manned helicopter or aircraft sees our drone, they're not going to know what you're thinking. They have no way of communicating. So they will always be reacting in a defensive manner. Even if you don't think there's going to be any threat, the pilot of that helicopter may not understand, and so they will be acting in a very defensive manner. Always make sure that you get out of the way in a manner that is clearly obvious to any other manned air traffic. So I'll go ahead and give everyone time to a bio break to recover a little bit. And I know that a whole bunch of questions popped up on the Q&A. And so during this break, I'll go ahead and see if I can answer a couple of them. And we'll pick up with our night flying at 11:05. So we'll give everyone a nice 7-minute break there.